We'll give everyone a few moments to hop in here.
I mean, they might not be in that way. Like,
All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for joining us this beautiful evening. Tonight, we're going to be learning a little bit more about The Great Indoorsman, a collection of essays by Andrew Farkas. But first, I'll tell you a little bit more about our author and guest today. Andrew Farkas is an assistant professor of English at Washburn University. He is the author of The Big Red Herring, Sunsphere, and self-titled debut. And we're going to be hearing about The Great Indoorsman today. Although I do want to hear about those other books as well. If we can talk, maybe sneak in a little chat about that. Colin Rafferty was born in Kansas City, Missouri, but grew up on the Kansas side. He went to land-grant universities and eventually got an MFA from the University of Alabama. He writes about monuments and memorials, presidents, and Vietnam. He teaches nonfiction writing at the University of Mary Washington. Thanks for joining us, everyone. And without further ado, I'm going to throw it over to our speakers this evening.
Thank you very much for having us. And I'm going to start off by reading a little bit. This is from the essay, The Great Indoorsman. It's from a philosophy of the indoors, where I lived and what I lived for. I went to the indoors because, like Henry David Thoreau, I wished to live deliberately. I wished to front only the essential facts of life and see if I could not learn what it had to teach, and not, when I came to die, discover that I had not lived. But, well, I found I wasn't exactly cut out for that sort of deal. It didn't really agree with me to speak, sounding rather romantic and bombastic. It'd take a hardier constitution than I have, the right hombre for the role being several orders of magnitude manlier than me, and require a whole lot more patience, the Spartan life, leading to like watching ants fight it out and what have you. So I figured the unsucked marrow of life, sure, it'd be just fine encased in the bones of whatever larger being this metaphor is referring to, while in the meantime I'd master resignation, not in a broken and defeated way, not in a fatalistic way, but more in the Falstaffian way of being gloriously resigned to the pleasures and experiences which suit me, those being the modulated wantonness and controlled chaos of the in-of-doors, where we're not so concerned with reducing life to its lowest terms, because that sounds like roughing it, and I mean, are you kidding me? Not a chance. So instead, here we let the burgeoning human world cut a fairly broad swath through our psyches, never shaving so close as to be intimidating, though. Here we admire the beautiful on purpose, knowing it'll never drive us out of our comfort zones and into a corner, forcing us to act as the out of doors most certainly would at some point. And here we finally put to rout the idea that there's something wrong with living inside, with its temperature control and comfortable furniture and lack of rampaging predators or slithering sacks of neurotoxin or airborne stinging pests. For most folks, it appears to me, think of the indoors not as a habitat constructed lovingly for them, but as some sort of necessary evil that, truth to be told, given our collective druthers, whoever stole them in the first damn place, we'd happily escape from. We'd get away from it all, as they say, but really, to where at would we go? I'm thinking it'd just be another space indoors. And this is one more excerpt from The Great Indoorsman. An excerpt from A Guide to the Indoors, Shopping. The gallery furniture cafeteria was almost empty. A ray of sunlight slanting through a gigantic window fell yellow on tables that needed bussing, recently occupied by a horde of children and their spunky parents. It was a remarkably lonesome moment. Raucous music roared from the 450-inch telescreen. Uncalled, a memory floated into my mind of a plush family room where me and my friends celebrate our New Year's Eve tradition, bad movie night, everyone bringing one entertainingly lousy film, everyone joyously mocking. furniture had been taken and making everywhere were slogans in black letters on white paper, espousing capitalistic success via hard work and determination, espousing obnoxious forms of patriotism, espousing eye-rolling and groan-inducing Christian morality. But unlike in the film, these slogans were not subliminal, not hidden by alien technology. No, they were unabashedly on display, including inexplicably, "What does not kill me makes me stronger," from Friedrich Nietzsche. Although completely out of place on the walls, Nietzsche would have fit in with us as we lampooned the gallery furniture coat of arms, which contained both the silhouette of the state of Texas and also Texas inside the silhouette, to further establish the silhouette of Texas was indeed Texas and not some imposter state. The fact that this furniture store for some reason had shrines to Elvis and Princess Diana. The fact that this furniture store had a tennis machine with court and a medieval castle playground. The fact that it not only had a theater marquee, "Coming soon" chairs, and a Vegas-style sign, but was also as disorienting to walk through as any casino. The fact that the 450-inch TV obviously wasn't enough, so televisions were mounted absolutely everywhere, many of which were playing gallery furniture commercials, inexorably demanding how delighted you'd be if you came to gallery furniture. No mention of what if you're already on site, begging the question, is there a higher plane gallery furniture, a mystical gallery furniture? Is the vision of gallery furniture that I see your vision's greatest enemy? The fact that cameras cover every square inch of this emporium, apparently fully embracing any vision you might have for the place, that if you may have just received the red, white, and blue basketball completely covered furniture logos so that you'd have an unimpeded view of that logo no matter how you held the ball. The fact that international flags pervaded, making us think Mattress Mac believes each of those countries is located in his store, which it makes sense seeing as how his book, Always Think Big, might indicate the world's population will soon live under one banner, gallery furnitures. The fact that this wasn't really a furniture store at all, but a theme park dedicated to the outrageous, absurd, and insufferable spirit of this state, typified by Lone Star Beer's ad slogan, "The National Beer of Texas." But the lesson of Bad Movie Night is that whereas lampooning makes some of the films barely endurable, others come alive and, like their poorly constructed monsters, suck you inside, make you thankful they are the way they are, no matter how ludicrous, because you get to interact with them. You get to jeer at them, though your irony, your vitriol can never raise you above this travesty, so you can look down on it, can never truly get you outside of the thing itself. But why would the Great Indoorsman want to be outside? What has the outside ever done for him? The Great Indoorsman gazed up at the gargantuan telescreen where gallery furniture owner Jim McIngvale was speaking rapidly, bopping and juking, about to leap from the two-dimensional world into the store. 40 minutes it had taken to understand the fuck. I mean, really, 40 minutes. Oh, cruel, needless misunderstanding. Oh, stubborn, self-willed exile from the Texas-sized breast. 2 Coca-Cola brand scented tears trickled down the sides of his nose. But it was all right. Everything was all right. The struggle was finished. As the commercials relentlessly foretold, he was delighted, so extremely delighted. There are no small emotions here, intensely, terrifyingly delighted. Because he loved gallery furniture, and he knew Mattress Mac was going to save him money today.
There's a great line in that excerpt that you read about as disorienting as disorienting to walk through as any casino, and it made me think about like the role of the narrator in a lot of these essays, because you come, as we learned in the introduction, right, from the world of fiction, which has embraced the unreliable narrator, but nonfiction still has this kind of veneer of like, trust me, I'm going to tell you the truth of this. But you've got essays in here in which you very much act as a kind of pool hall hustler. You talk about the front. Like, to what extent do you, like, what do you see your relationship with the reader of essays to be? Like, what's your job for them as the person writing and as the person narrating these essays?
Well, one of the things that I was interested in was talking about the fact that all of these indoor spaces that I'm going to frequently have built-in fictions that we accept as reality. And so I wanted to bring those to the forefront. And so I found it very interesting to talk about fiction while writing creative nonfiction. And I do the thing definitely where, you know, I'm also sure that frequently we say, oh, this is really happening. And yet, while we say this is really happening, we are thinking of some sort of fiction that is framing that thing that's really happening. And so, for instance, in the pool hall piece, I talk about the fact that even now, if I go pool hall, someone will immediately make the joke of, oh, do you want to play for money? As if like there are hustlers operating. And to me, yes, once upon a time, there were definitely hustlers, but man, there aren't enough people who played pool enough when they were younger to be arrogant enough to like go up against one. And so I use those sorts of fictions in order to show people that this thing that we have constructed called reality at the same time contains a whole lot of fiction.
Almost like the kind of the Borgesian like back room and everything you were looking for, right? Which is if anybody who's worked retail has had that experience of like having someone ask, like, can you go look in the back room to see if this is there? As though somewhere in the back room is just as you point out, as somewhere in the back room is just everything that ever existed.
Absolutely. And so having worked in a drugstore and having, you know, people countless times look at the shelves, find that their products are not there, and then they ask me to go to the back room. And after a while, I really just started to see the back room the way they saw it. And it was this magical place that contained everything. And I was like, that's fantastic, because that's really reality for them. They really believe it's back there and everything is back there. And so I think that I had a lot of fun playing.
Speaking of playing, can you talk a little bit about like the use of voice in this book? Because there are essays in here where you're very much taking on a kind of distinct literary, almost, you know, you wrote Thoreauvian in a way in the introduction that you read. There's an essay in which you're mimicking Lovecraft's style. There's a Beckett-like essay in here, but also essays that feel very voice-driven in a Farkas type ways. Can you talk a little bit about how you move from your voice to other voices and maybe how you integrate?
So one thing that is interesting to me is writing was always tied up with the way the writing sounds. And so when I write, I will continue to write drafts until everything sounds right. And so consequently, I'm like, I guess you could say I'm obsessed with voices. And so those voices are going to drive however, you know, the essay is, you know, whatever the essay is doing. Reading them out again and again and again. And to the point where later on when I found out, because I talked to other writers and they're like, yeah, I never do that. I was shocked. Like it is the dumb one. Everyone does it, right? And then you find out, no, that is not how everyone does it. But yeah, so that was that's something that has always driven my writing. The other thing is that I feel like I, you know, enjoy inhabiting those different voices, because like in my life, like at different times, I will not necessarily narrate, but depending on what I'm doing, like it sounds different to me, or my voice in my head sounds different to me. And so I bring that to the writing.
Yeah, I'm thinking there's a way in which, and this is sort of grossly oversimplifying things, but a lot of nonfiction that's based on the writer kind of falls into two categories. One is I have this amazing story that happened to me, you know, full of adventure, and you know, then we had our passports confiscated at the border and all. And then there's the kind of essay that comes out of nothing really interesting has happened here, but I have a voice that lets me tell it in this interesting way. And that, because you're writing about a lot of sort of quotidian America, like bowling, you know, bowling alleys and shopping malls and video stores, that there's a kind of way in which the voice drives those pieces as much as any narrative does.
Absolutely, and I feel like part of that is the humor that I bring to it, and so I think of it like a stand-up comedian. So like depending on what joke you're telling, you're going to deliver it in a certain way. And early on, I watched a ton of stand-up comedy. And so I feel like, you have somebody like Stephen Wright, who is one of my favorites, but is extremely deadpan. And then I was lucky enough to see George Carlin multiple times in my life, and he's opposite. He's nothing like Stephen Wright. And so I feel like that is one way that I'm able to tell these, because I was constantly asking myself, why would anybody want to hear about me? And which I think is maybe the creative nonfiction thing, right? Unless you're like super famous, or like, you were a part of some event that is extremely famous, you're constantly going to ask yourself, how can I get someone to care about this? And so I think one of the ways that I do it is through that voice, which I think aids in a lot of the humor that I use.
You talk about humor, and I think there's an issue. Okay, the setup question for this is: did you have cable as a teen?
Yes.
Did you spend a lot of time watching hours and hours of stand-up clips on like the Comedy Channel before it became Comedy Central?
So actually, let me see if I can remember. I think A&E was the station that had like Caroline's Comedy Hour and the Improv. And so I watched those. And then actually MTV, before it was ruined by reality television, had the MTV half-hour comedy hour. And so I watched all of those constantly. And even when I was a little kid, I watched Monty Python, which was also on MTV for a while. And my dad was kind of amazed that I had any idea what was going on.
Well, I've learned about that as a kind of source of humor in writing, because there is this sort of absurd-ish element to it that seems to come out of a kind of stand-up comedy that existed for a while in the 90s, right? It was just like it was there, and there was a bunch of it because there wasn't a lot of scripted comedy television on cable channels, and they had to fill it with something.
Yeah.
So just as latchkey kids had to fill their time with something as well, right? Like you just sort of like, when I say you, I mean me, you just watched a ton of stand-up comedy because that was what was on.
Absolutely, and it's influenced me enormously to the point where there are, like, for instance, Stephen Wright is probably the biggest one. There are times where I will listen to one of his routines just to get in the right headspace. And I don't necessarily think I sound like him very often, because I tend to do longer sentences rather than the very terse deadpan sort of thing that he does. But I feel like the absurdism that you were talking about, I think that comes out from me.
Let's talk about genre a bit here. There's an essay in here called "Still Life with Alarm Clocks," which is about your sort of the unfortunate coincidences you've had over the years of finding or being awoken in the middle of the night in a motel by an alarm clock that someone has set, not you. And there's a part where you talk about how you tell the story. I'll read this quick paragraph. On the other hand, Andy could yank the alarm clock out of the wall, storm down to the lobby, demand to know why in the world, but before he can finish, he'll be interrupted by an in-progress robbery, an action story, a drug deal in the process of going wrong, a suspense story, a parent who's been evicted and needs a place to put the kids up for the night, a sob story, a trippy clown convention that has either gotten lost, a comedic story, or arrived here for inexplicable reasons, an artsy story, or that claims to have gotten lost, but as the plot continues to unfold, the clown's objective grow an oddity until the expected corpses start showing up, a horror story, and all because Andy got his lazy ass out of bed, since it's unlikely he'd be able to catch any more Z's anyway, instead of pretending to sleep after shutting the racket off, which, as it turns out, is what he actually does. And it's interesting in that paragraph that you work through all these kind of fictional possibilities in terms of genre before landing on but this is what actually happened. So, and I think what I want to get at here is how much of your experience as a fiction writer is coming into moments like that as in essays, right?
Right. I would say that my fiction writing was huge in influencing my creative nonfiction. And the biggest thing that I had to do in writing creative nonfiction is remind myself that if I do make things up, I definitely have to frame it. Right. And so that was very important. But I would say that this also goes back to that idea of if you're in a particular indoor space, there might be a story attached to it. But I think people are frequently influenced by various fictional stories, either movies, TV, written, whatever it is. They're influenced by these stories. and they end up thinking about themselves in, as they move through their lives, and they are framed by those stories. And I think that also often they're not willing to admit it. So one of the things that I talk about in the book is I saw a cartoonist, and the cartoonist was asked what fiction that he read. And he said, I don't read fiction because at some point I realized, oh, that's just something someone made up. And I wanted to say, I don't like cartoons because I realized that's something someone just drew. But I didn't say that. That right there is the thing, is I feel like we approach it and we say, no, I'm focused on reality. And I'm like, reality has a whole lot of fiction in it, whether we're willing to accept that or not. So.
If we can talk shop for a second here, like where does an essay or a short story begin in terms of like even actual construction? Like you start with the title, you start with the first sentence, the sort of conclusion, anything like that. And then the flip of that, like when do you know that you're done? Like when do you say, okay, this is a finished draft and I can walk away from it?
Normally, the big idea that I'm trying to get across in whatever particular piece I happen to be writing. And this is the case with creative nonfiction and with fiction. And so I figure out what kind of story I can use when I'm connecting to this particular idea. And so, for instance, I really started, so the essay, When Hamburger Station is Busy, it's built like a thought problem. And that is because at the beginning of the essay, I point out that whenever I go to this particular hamburger joint with my dad called Hamburger Station, and we go there for lunch, I point out that nobody is there, and he says, oh, it's busier at dinner time. And when we go to the same place for dinner, he says, oh, it's busier at lunchtime. And to me, that sounds like a physics thought problem. And so that is now the way that I'm going to build it. But then I say, what are the events that I'm going to use? Like, what is the writing style? But I have that idea first. And so then I start writing draft after draft. And I'm one of those people who early drafts are really difficult because it's not doing everything I want it to. It doesn't match up to like the sound and the idea of it in my mind. And so then I just keep writing drafts. The early ones, maybe I can only work for like 45 minutes a day when I first start because it's so difficult. And then I just keep spinning through more and more drafts. And when I'm getting close to the end, I can work for any amount of time. And then I know it's done when I read it out loud and everything sounds right. I don't like stumble at any point. And then like I get to the end and it just feels like the construction that I was aiming for, even though I didn't know exactly what that was going to be at the beginning. But suddenly that construction has all come together.
In terms of influences, because you've got the great essay in here about the video store, right? And searching for a particular video. Like what non-literary influences do you find showing up in your writing? You mentioned like sort of watching Monty Python and standard comedy and things like that. Are there other non-book influences that you can point to and say like, yeah, that's where my writing comes from?
Well, I would say that there are a lot of movies that I use throughout this book. And so I would say that as movies go, I teach a cult films class, so there are a great deal of cult films. And one of the things that I can say that influenced me, although I really didn't realize it early on, was my experience of going to the Rocky Horror Picture Show. I started going to that when I was in high school. The first time I went, friends of mine had already gone before. I knew zero about it, nothing at all. And I went in and it was a completely different experience of going to a movie. And so I would say that I feel like I try to bring that same essence to all of the pieces that I write, where frequently I like to hear when people say something. A friend of mine once said, I never know what's going to happen next in something you write, not in the page turner sort of way, but just in the anything at all can happen next.
Yeah, there's always that sense in Rocky Horror, kind of you mentioned Rocky Horror and the kind of old tradition of going to whatever art house theater or whatever mall theater, then convinced to show it, and then but there's that sense of like having to kind of figure out the rules as the game went along. Right?
Yeah,
and just like, oh, this is when we do this is when we yell this stage. And your stories and essays kind of have that feel of that, like the instructions are contained within them, but often sort of hidden in a couple of different layers of various mystery.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I feel like that led to me teaching the cult films class. And so John Carpenter's, I mentioned John Carpenter's They Live, and then the Filktail essay is about looking for a copy of Dark Star. And then also, I took multiple film classes throughout my time as a student. And so I got, the classics. So I have Last Year at Marienbad in there. And then, like a lot of film noir, because I worked on that while I was getting my PhD. So you have the history of film noir and neo-noir. And so I have a great deal of that. And I would say that all of those movies, Army of Darkness, I would say is another one, and Evil Dead 2. I would say that all of those kinds of movies frequently play with what a movie is and what it can do and how it can go about it. And so I feel like I end up doing that in my writing too.
There's an essay in here called Noir Girl, an essay in 2 takes. And that's an essay that kind of, maybe more than any other essay in the book, feels like it sort of dips in this traditional like wellspring of emotion that memoir, I think that maybe we associate memoir with, right? That there's this idea of like what you do in a memoir essay is you tell this sort of deep, emotional, effective story here. Which is often not, like you're writing about things that are significant and important to you throughout the book, but not in that sort of like, and this meant so much to me, and like, but this is the essay that kind of flirts with that stuff. Like how did that essay come about, and why does it take 2 takes to get to it?
So so one of the things is that it's called Noir Girl, and that part comes from film noir and neo-noir. But the other thing is that I'm talking about somebody who I knew I could not describe. I could not use her name, and I'll leave it for the readers to find out why. But so consequently, I had to deal with someone who I felt a weird attachment to, but I really wanted to respect her privacy, I guess I'll say. And so I feel like that weird attachment and also like very much wanting to be, respectful and stuff like that. I feel like this experience ended up becoming something that was really important and honestly led to this book, because that was the first one where I said, I'm writing the book, The Great Indoorsman. That was the first essay that I started working on. And I think that it's just that I knew so many different things going on behind the scenes that I couldn't necessarily use, that it's consequently maybe like the emotion came forward, because in the other ones, it's like, I can tell anybody anything, everybody's fine with it. So I, at the same time, will do all of my, fun things that I do throughout the essays. Whereas in this one, I do those things, but also I am like kind of bound to the emotion of it.
You asked a couple times that you write fiction, that your 3 previous books are all fiction. And the advantage of writing fiction, it strikes me as somebody on the outside, is that fiction always gets shelved in the fiction section. And often bookstores, present company excluded, right? Like they don't know what to do with creative nonfiction. Right? And there's, it's over here, it's over in this section, or it's over in this section. So if you were a bookstore clerk, like where are you shelving this? If there's not just a straight up essays or creative nonfiction section.
Literature. That's difficult, and I feel I even talk about that in the essay that's called A Front or a Front, where I talk about the fact that even that term, creative nonfiction, is extremely fraught. And one of the essays that got picked up by a journal, the editor wrote back to me immediately and said, normally when somebody submits to us and says, I'm submitting creative nonfiction, I'm not very excited about their submission. And then he said, but in your case, it worked out, so we're taking the piece. And I was like, well, that's great. But I think that's the problem is that we want to think of reality as simple.
Yeah.
And it's not. So consequently, we have, even though I would say creative nonfiction is probably the most popular creative genre, because it is connected to nonfiction, at the same time, people wrestle with all of the different names for it. Like just calling it nonfiction is like saying that I'm going to the zoo to see the vertebrates. Nobody is going to say that. But if you say journalism, that feels like something completely different. If you say essays, people think of, oh, well, isn't that what I had to write in my freshman English class? And so I feel like that's why we end up wrestling with that.
Though to be fair, we're not too far from the National Zoo here in Washington. And a couple of years ago, which I think I mean more like 10 years ago, when faced with some kind of economic shrinkage, the zoo had to close one of its sections, and the one that they closed was invertebrates. So I
didn't realize.
Yeah, so I like that, especially because invertebrates are what, like 95% of all animal species. I'm probably getting that wrong, but yeah, I really like the idea of that. What the place you put this was to actually go even more general, right? Like, okay, like let's forget genre, forget anything. Like it just goes in literature,
right?
Like, put it in books, put it in bound paper, put it in these bound papers, and that idea of just kind of figuring out sort of where to place anything. My all-time favorite rejection that I got for an essay was one from a journal that wrote back and said, "We really like this, but we decided it was fiction." just like so beautiful and poetic that it's.
We decided this was
fiction. I can't be angry about that. So let me see. Let's talk Tuscaloosa a little bit here, because you and I, we met in the MFA program in Tuscaloosa, and there's a way in which the South, but we're both from the Midwest, and so the Midwest doesn't feel like a very mythologized version of the country. It just feels like this sort of blank space for a lot of people. But the South feels deeply mythologized.
Oh yeah,
right, and like it has these kind of stories that it tells about itself, and these stories that the outside tells about it as well. It's almost a little bit like Plutarch's Plutarch and talking about the Spartans, right? Like in the South, they do these things that are very and the men are all 20 feet tall, and the football players. And so you've got an essay in here about Tuscaloosa called "Somewhere Better Than This Place," right? Which is about a con man who approaches you multiple times in the city, but also kind of talks about you existing in the city as somebody walking around the town in a place where nobody walks. And so I think like there's a kind of outsider quality to both you and the con man in Tuscaloosa that maybe, I don't know, I have a question here that I'm never getting at. So that any point you kind of pull a question out of it.
Sure. No, so the thing that I would say is that Tuscaloosa was the big culture shock for me. Because before Tuscaloosa, I moved to Knoxville, Tennessee, and I lived there for 2 years, and I had no expectations for Knoxville, Tennessee. And when I got there, honestly, a lot of the stuff that I had in Northeast Ohio was there. And so it felt familiar. It wasn't all of the stuff, but it still felt somewhat familiar. And I was like, oh, well, if this is the South, it's not that different from where I'm from. And then I moved to Tuscaloosa, and it was different. There was a lot of the stuff that I was used to having wasn't there. And then like I was interacting with people in completely different ways. And so the con man is one of them, where I was excited at first because I wanted this to, again, I'm connecting to fiction. I wanted it to be like, the movies in film noir movies where con men and, confidence games are being played and stuff like that. I wanted it to be that. And then it obviously wasn't, but at the same time, I wasn't really understanding it. And so that like essay is me moving through like this place that finally feels like the South to me. Although at the same time, that is, brought to me by a lot of fiction. Whereas Knoxville was the place that didn't feel like it, didn't feel like that, because it didn't measure up to the fiction that I was used to.
Yeah, and then there's a strange way in which, and certainly we're kind of talking about the Tuscaloosa MFA, or the University of Alabama MFA program of 15, 20 years ago, that there was an attrition rate there that every year there's a first year guys who was just like, nope, I'm out, right? Who would do a year just like, I'm out of here, I cannot handle this. That I never saw anywhere else. And there's this sort of, there's a kind of test to that place in the way that it existed both in harmony and in disharmony with.
That's true, although the funny thing is that you hear not necessarily about programs, but you hear that's like, people trying to keep their distance from the Midwest too.
Yeah. Okay.
And that is always like summed up in the same thing, which is whenever they refer to the Midwest, they say, I don't know, it's just so flat. And it's every time it's the same sort of line, and it's like nothing interesting could happen there because the landscape isn't dramatic. There's no volcanoes, there's none of that. Instead, there's the flatness, and people frequently push away from the Midwest because of that.
In the essay Bolorama, right, the opening lines are, what, bowling? Come on, bowling? It ain't a sport. So what is it then? Like, and what's the relationship between bowling and sports like that, or non-sports like that, with your own writing?
So I would say that frequently people are going to think of bowling and pool and then anything that you can play in a casino as entertainments. And the interesting thing to me about bowling, well, for one thing, I wanted to focus on a bunch of indoor spaces that people don't necessarily think of as beautiful.
Yeah.
Because when I was going to write the Great Indoorsman, I'm like, okay, I think probably the essay about the Louvre being beautiful has been written. And so I wanted to write about all of these spaces that I really like, but nobody is going to be like the beautiful bowling alleys of all of this particular area. So that was one thing. The other thing about bowling that's interesting to me, though, is the people who say that it's not a sport. I present the idea that in order to be truly amazing at this thing, it's extraordinarily hard. And I say that all of the other stuff in the bowling alley that you think about, like the fact that people are probably drinking cheap beer and cheap whiskey and eating junk food, and you have little kids rolling bowling balls down the back of a dinosaur, like all of that is set up like from the old kung fu movies where the kung fu master is like, oh, there's nothing for you here, just go. And you have to keep saying, no, I want to be here. And so I feel like I do that in a number of essays, because I think that there are those times in order to see something differently, you have to keep pushing on it. And so I think that that's the defamiliarization that I end up using.
And it strikes me that a lot of that, I mean, you and I both teach writing to undergraduates, and a lot of that kind of, push aside the distraction. Like, if you want to do this and do this in a beautiful way, like, you've got to, there's got to be a level of focus and determination, despite the junk food and the beer and bottle shaped like bowling pins and all that stuff. And there's like a kind of odd religious, spiritual, almost holy kind of pursuit to that.
Absolutely. And I would say that even though, like, I talk about being an atheist in the book,
Yeah.
I would say that I'm very much attached to that sort of view of writing. And at the same time, I do, think about how like everything will disappear at some point. And so I think about art in that way too. It's both the thing that will outlive me, but it won't actually last forever and ever. So,
it's strange because you and I are both in kind of at the tail end of Generation X, and one of the kind of defining elements of that is that we were there for the shutdown of the analog generation, or the analog systems, right? So we look up things in card catalogs. You and I both took typing classes in high school where we learned on typewriters. But at the same time, also have a familiarity with like the new incoming digital stuff. And so, is this in a way, because this is a book about a lot of these things, indoor malls and pool halls and bowling alleys and things that feel like they're kind of getting stampeded and rolled over by whatever you would like to fill in the blank with. Like, how much is this a book about loss?
Absolutely, loss and nostalgia for these things. Although the thing that I always think about is the fact that nostalgia doesn't necessarily mean I absolutely want it back.
Yeah.
And so that is something that I see, as like they make movies out of like the, kind of cheesy TV shows I watched when I was a little kid. It's like, I don't need a Chips movie,
Yeah.
even though they made one.
Yeah.
And so this book is very much, I feel like it is showing loss where, yes, I can think about this and fondly remember video rental stores and the people who worked at them, and how sometimes they were amazing at pointing like to new movies that you had never seen before. And by new, I mean new to you. All of that was, yes, very important to me, and it's very important to this book. But I think that in like writing about it, I'm showing that I don't necessarily want it back. Instead, I think it is better for us to think on these things, to remember them, and as we move forward, like continue to remember that it wasn't always the same way, without being like, okay, now we have a bunch of blockbusters that we've reopened and it's like, no, we don't need that.
Which I don't know. I mean, again, we're speaking of these broad cultural stereotypes here, but there's also a way in which the millennial colleagues I have, or millennial students that I've taught, like there is a kind of nostalgia with them of like, oh yeah, bring back this thing from my childhood, please, please. And that happened some with Generation X, but I think we also had, I don't know, I feel like this is George Lucas's fault, right? Because I think we had that idea of like, oh man, we love those movies. And then in the mid 90s, like, oh, he's going to do the prequels.
Right.
And then they came out, we're like, oh, these are terrible. Never mind. Like, we should have just left that alone.
Well, I think, so the overall idea, and this is probably simplified, but that Generation X is perfectly fine with being cynical.
Yeah.
And so we don't have a problem with saying, oh yeah, this was great, but if you try to do it again, it would be really stupid.
I know you're going to read one more thing here, and so I've got one more question for you, which is I have a theory that every writer has one thing that they've written that they hold in their head as like, this is the best thing I've ever written, like kind of their golden story or essay or poem or whatever. Do you have one of those? And if so, what is it?
It's difficult because I always, to me, I always think that it's my novel, the Big Red Herring, and that's because it took me 6 years to write. And I feel like I put everything into that novel that I had been building up towards. But at the same time, The Great Indoorsman is now me, even though it's very much about my past, at the same time, it's me like exploring new ways to go about writing. And part of that came from the fact that I felt like I had dumped so much into the novel that now it was time to find something else. Yeah. And so that was why I went to create a nonfiction, because after the novel, I said, I have to do something different. And so that is how this book came about. And it was written during the pandemic, but I didn't want it to be a pandemic book because people would say to me, oh, you're the Great Indoorsman, so you must love the pandemic. And I'm like, no, I love going to lots of different indoor spaces. And right now I can go to the grocery store in my apartment. That's not enough. All right, so I will read one more piece. This is the very end of the essay, The Great Indoorsman. It is called A Fragment of the Indorsiad, or The Epic of the Great Indoorsman, The Prophecy of the Great Indoorsman. In the future, at some point, you'll ask me to go camping with you. Do not despair, it has happened before, it will happen again. When you do, when you extend to me this invitation, I will be polite, I will listen to your pitch, I will encourage you to relive your favorite memories of bucolic surroundings of life in the out of doors. Ultimately, you'll talk about getting away as if there were anything to escape, about returning to our roots, though I was born inside, about the majesty of various mountains, about the terrifying sublimity of the jungle, about the serenity of the forest, about the brutal beauty of the desert, about the ponderous expanse of the plains, about pristine lakes, about vast oceans, about rolling rivers, about nature. In a compromise, you'll perhaps even offer the rambunctious joy of mainstream campsites where each lot has electrical outlets, where shower houses and bathrooms are to be found, where stores and even restaurants are nearby, where carousers sit around fires, underneath the stars, drink beer from the can, and soak it all in. Definition of it, an explanation as to why it must be absorbed, unspecified, likely unspecifiable. When I appear impassive, stoical, you will say with maximum confusion, with maximum frustration, for goodness sakes, it's the outdoors. From the comfort of a temperature-controlled room, I will inform you that I have been to the out of doors. It's not for me. Dazed, despondent, defeated, you'll depart headed in the direction of whatever sort of nature you prefer. Will that be the end? It will not. For while you are hemmed in by that flora, while you are surrounded by that fauna, you'll get an idea. Nature of the idea? Epiphanic, delusional. If only you will think I could formulate the right words, the proper phrases, the precise sentences, then I could convince his indoorsiness to venture forth into nature. Will you succeed this time? The only reason I'm able to bring myself to tell you that you will not is because you won't believe me. For upon returning from your expedition, you'll be rejuvenated, restored, revitalized. You will have been made whole by the open air. So when you step foot back into civilization, you won't do so as a bowed and broken subject of the modern world, but as an explorer, a conqueror, the one being who can bend the will of anyone, no matter how resolute. And so completely confident, absolutely assured, replete with resolve, in the name of nature, you will go forth and seek out the lair of the Great Indoorsman. You'll know where to find me. Thank you.
Thank you. We have a few questions in the live stream here.
Okay.
Is there a social theory on indoor dwelling you're developing through these essays, a sort of autoethnographic exploration of an understudied social moment?
So the thing that I would say is that when I was going through English departments, we were still very much like reading the canon. In fact, when I was at the University of Tennessee and I was in the MA program, they handed me a list, which was pretty much the Western canon, and said, read this. And so at different times you read about, for instance, the Romantics and the Transcendentalists, and then later on some of the realists. They were very much about the outdoors, and almost, I would say, it seemed like they were saying that the move away from the outdoors was wrong. And I'm perfectly fine with everybody who loves camping and whatnot, but that's not for me. I love the indoors. And so I guess you could say that I'm starting the literature of indoorsiness.
Yeah, there was a New Yorker article a couple of years ago that presented the fact that humans spend more time indoors than sperm whales spend submerged.
Wow.
But it presents it as this and isn't that a tragedy? And I mean, one of the things I really kind of appreciate about the book is that it says, well, wait, no. If this is what we've been moving towards all along, what human civilization has built is a kind of way to escape all.
I like that.
A lot of the places described in your essays are thought of contemporaneously as liminal spaces. Aesthetically, do you have anything to say about that?
I mean, I feel like I'm attracted to the places that are normally not the most popular places. And that doesn't mean, so for instance, I love museums. So I said earlier that I feel like the essay about the Louvre was already written. I would definitely go there whenever I get the chance to go to France. But at the same time, I feel like in my life, I end up in all of these liminal spaces. As the person said, and to be honest, I love them, and I feel like people don't necessarily think about them as much. They might take them for granted, and so I'm pointing out how they can be seen as amazing and beautiful and extremely interesting also. And I don't know, I think that maybe my personality is just part of that I'm attracted, for instance, I teach a cult films class. Cult films, one of the ways to define them as a movie that did extremely poorly at first, and then later on, found its audience, but its audience, goes again and again, or watches the movies again and again. And so I feel like that sort of mentality is mine. And so I end up attached to these places.
Is the indoors a more optimistic reflection on modernity, speaking towards the untragedy of indoorsiness?
Well, sure. So I think that there are plenty of people who think of the tragedy of modernity. And yeah, so I would say that maybe my take on it is more positive. I wouldn't say that I at the same time, like I said before, I think it's the fact that there probably are plenty of people who are very much indoors people, and I've met some of them on my book tour, and they don't know how to talk about that. So I think that they had already loved it and just hadn't thought about it in that way.
Got one more here, and then if any of you folks have questions, just let me know. How do you think this indoors literature can change the pandemic discourse on indoor/outdoor dwelling?
Well, that's interesting. Although at the same time, what I said before was the absolute lockdown version. That wasn't a time of excitement for me because of the fact that we couldn't go to other places. I completely understood why we were doing what we were doing, and I did it myself. But at the same time, I feel like maybe it's once you get beyond the pandemic, then you can go out and explore all of the different indoor spaces. And so I think of it more like that. I think. If that answers the question.
I'm sure it does. Any questions from our viewers?
I have no questions, but thanks for the conversation. Really interesting. Thank you.
So we have a few more minutes, so I'd like to sneak in my questions from me about your bibliography as a whole and how kind of the Great Indoorsman fits in with this is your first piece of nonfiction?
Yes, so this is my other three books are all fiction, and this was my first time writing creative nonfiction.
So how do you feel this fits into the rest of your bibliography? How does it relate to the fiction that you've written before?
So I really feel like the writing style frequently is similar to what I've done before. I would say that I just continue to expand it. And so I was very obviously, I'm heavily influenced by the postmodernist writers, and Donald Barthelme I mentioned, Laurie Moore would be another one, those sorts of folks. But I would say that it fits into it, but at the same time, you can see how I'm expanding out with even more styles. And that I really like doing that. Even my novel is written in many different styles, even though it's one novel. And these are many different essays written all in different styles. And I guess you could say that I don't think of myself as a person with just one style. I try to explore different styles depending on what the piece is that I'm writing.
Great. When we're talking about sort of the grace and beauty of indoor spaces, I wonder if you have done any reading outside of your own writing, of course, that has contributed to your kind of philosophy about this. For example, there is something about indoor spaces that's very special, which is that they are created by humans for humans, whereas outdoor spaces are unfeeling towards humans. So I wonder if you have some either reading that you've done about that or thinking that you've done about that that's not in the book.
So actually, Colin helped me while I was writing this book because of the fact that I asked for a number of essays about the outdoors. And I brought that sort of thinking and writing to my writing about the indoors. And so I guess you could say one of the things that I was already doing in my fiction was I would frequently present a particular kind of story, and then I would find some way to undermine that story. And by undermine, I don't mean, like I have defeated it. I just mean like, look, this is what this thing's doing, and now I'm going to do this thing that's kind of different. But also is, very conscious of where this sort of story has been before. And so I think that that's what I did here. So I read the part that was very much like a response to Thoreau. I had Bouvier and various other people who I had read for the outdoorsy kind of writing. I had to read Emerson, of course. Cheryl Strayed was another one, although she has a very different view of the outdoors. But I feel like that is what I did. It wasn't so much that I read about the indoors. Instead, I read about the outdoors and then presented the indoors in a way similar, but it can't be exactly the same because it's a different space.
Thank you. So far on your book tour, what are some of the reactions that you've gotten? What kinds of audiences have you encountered? And what's been the general response to The Great Indoorsman so far?
Well, luckily, a number of people have thought that the essays were funny, and that's something that I'm definitely. So I'm very much. I hear a lot of writers who I find to be funny. I'm not going to call anybody out, but I hear a number of writers who I find to be funny, and then in interviews, like the interviewer says, "Oh, this is very funny," and then they say, "Well, I wasn't trying to be funny." Well, I am like very much the person who says, like, humor to me is a high literary form. And so since that's so important to me, I've been very happy to find that, yes, there are people who do find them funny. And then another great thing is going around and having people say, I feel like, so in Tuscaloosa, where I just did my last event, somebody said, I never thought about it before, but I think I'm an indoors person. So getting that sort of response too. I'm not starting a movement, to be honest, but at the same time, it is funny to for people to read the book and think, oh, well, I guess I think the same way. I just didn't realize that was a way to think.
Absolutely. I too am an indoors person.
Excellent.
I really appreciate this book of essays. Lastly, where can our viewers and audience keep up with you if they want to keep up with new things that you're putting out? Or
so I have a website. It's thegreatindoorsman.org. So and so I have that, and then I mean I have a Facebook and a Twitter, and so there too. But yeah, so I have 2 more stops on my tour coming up, one in Portland, Oregon, and one near Las Vegas. But mostly my website, and then also the social media. So
great. Well, thank you both for an incredible discussion. This has been great.
well, thank you. Yeah, thank you very much.
I'm going to stop now the live stream.
Clear. Yeah.
And
Thanks again.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Can you take a picture of us?
yes.
Yeah, excellent.
I'll